I don't think it's that bad. I think that it depends entirely on the circumstances and if it merits.
At 89, Sean Connery finally broke decades of silence and revealed what really happened between him and Roger Moore. It wasn't the polite Hollywood story fans thought they knew. It was raw, personal, and filled with moments that could rewrite the Bond legacy. This is the untold truth straight from Connery's own words, and once you hear it, you'll never look at their relationship the same way again. For years, the mystery lingered like a stubborn shadow over the James Bond legacy. Fans had argued, speculated, and even fought online about whether Sean Connery and Roger Moore were friends, rivals, or simply polite strangers bound by a shared role. The two men had carried the same cinematic torch, yet their versions of Seven couldn't have been more different. Connery's was sharp, gritty, and grounded in Cold War realism, while Moore's was smooth, witty, and dripping with playful charm. Interviews over the decades always seemed to dodge the big question. Whenever journalists tried to bait Connery into commenting directly on Moore, he would sidestep with a vague compliment or a change of subject. That silence only fed the rumors. Was there tension? Jealousy? Quiet disdain? No one really knew. Then, at the age of 89, Connery decided it was finally time to speak. By that point, he had been out of Hollywood for years, retired from acting, and far removed from the exhausting cycles of press junkets and media spin. He had nothing to gain and nothing to lose. This made his decision to address Roger Moore head-on all the more fascinating. When the interviewer cautiously brought up Moore's name, Connery didn't flinch. He leaned into the question, and for the first time, he spoke plainly. His words weren't bitter or theatrical. They were the kind of measured, confident truths that come from someone who's lived long enough to stop worrying about pleasing everyone. "I played Bond with reality, credibility," he said, choosing his words carefully and hopefully still encompassing stance and effect. Anything that happens is possible. It was the perfect summary of his approach, to make Bond believable, to keep the danger and the stakes intact, even while wearing the sharpest tuxedo in cinema. Then, with a slight shift in tone, he contrasted it with Moore's take. Roger took another direction. His is a sort of parody of the character, so you would go for the laugh or the humor at whatever the cost of the credibility or the reality. It was a statement that could have been taken as a jab, but it didn't feel like one. Connery wasn't dismissing Moore's skill, he was defining their differences. He recognized that Moore's Bond wasn't built to be menacing. It was designed to charm, to entertain, to make audiences laugh as much as gasp. For Connery, that wasn't his Bond, but he knew it worked for Moore's era. What made this confession so compelling was the way it stripped away decades of fan-fueled narratives. Connery wasn't harboring some secret vendetta, nor was he suddenly rewriting history to flatter Moore after his passing. He was simply telling the truth as he saw it. And in that truth, there was a surprising respect. Not for the style, perhaps, but for the results. Connery could see that Moore's lighter, more flamboyant Seven had carved out its own devoted audience, one that adored him for exactly those qualities Connery would never have chosen. For the fans who had spent years imagining icy stares across studio lots or whispered insults at industry parties, Connery's candor was a revelation. It wasn't a rivalry story at all. It was two craftsmen making two very different choices with the same role. And while Connery still stood by his vision of Bond as the realistic one, he finally acknowledged the obvious. Roger Moore had made it work in his own way. That single interview didn't just answer a question, it closed a chapter, giving fans a rare and honest look into a relationship that had been kept behind closed doors for nearly half a century. When you look back at the history of James Bond on the big screen, it's impossible not to see just how much the character has changed with the times. And nowhere is that change more obvious than when you put Sean Connery and Roger Moore side by side. They were both Seven. They both wore the tuxedo, drove the cars, and delivered the one-liners. But the truth is, they were playing the same man in completely different worlds. Connery's Bond was born in the early 1960s, a time when Cold War tensions were high, espionage felt real and dangerous, and audiences wanted their heroes to be sharp-edged and capable of real menace. Moore's Bond, on the other hand, belonged to the 1970s and 1980s, a period when cinema was leaning toward spectacle, escapism, and humor to distract from real-world problems. It's no wonder they each left such different marks on the character. Connery's era was defined by a kind of raw, masculine cool that made Bond feel like a genuine spy. His version of the character could charm a woman in one scene and take down an enemy with brutal efficiency in the next. There was a weight to him. You believed he had killed before and might do it again without hesitation if the mission demanded it. His Bond moved through a world of shadowy political plots, tense standoffs, and high-stakes danger that felt rooted in reality. Even the gadgets, as fun as they were, never fully took over the story. They were tools, not crutches. You could strip away the Aston Martin's gadgets or Q's inventions, and Connery's Bond would still get the job done with his fists, his wits, and his cold stare. By contrast, Moore's Bond walked into a world that was changing. The cultural mood had shifted. Audiences were tired of the grimness of the late 60s and early 70s, weighed down by political scandals and economic troubles. Cinema was offering more escapism, more fun, and more color. Moore stepped into that atmosphere with a version of Seven that was smoother, lighter, and deliberately less threatening. His Bond still saved the day, but he did it with a raised eyebrow, a clever quip, and a smirk that told you he was in on the joke. The villains in his movies were often bigger, bolder, and sometimes downright cartoonish, which meant Moore's Bond had to match that tone with a wink rather than a clenched jaw. This wasn't a weakness, it was a deliberate choice, and it worked. Moore's films were blockbusters for their time because they gave audiences exactly what they wanted: adventure without too much darkness. He leaned into outrageous stunts, exotic locations, and humor that could land with audiences all over the world. His Bond could disarm a bomb in a room full of people with the same kind of ease, just by flashing a smile. In many ways, he made Bond more approachable, even likable in a different way than Connery's more dangerous version. When you compare them, it's tempting to say one was better than the other, but really they were perfect for the eras they represented. Connery gave Bond his foundation: the ruthless charm, the sense of danger, the sophistication wrapped in steel. Without that, the franchise might never have become the global phenomenon it is today. But Moore kept Bond alive through a very different cinematic landscape, making sure the character didn't become outdated or irrelevant. He opened the door for Bond to adapt, proving that the role wasn't locked into one interpretation. Even the differences in their styles tell the story of two different worlds. Connery's action scenes were often gritty and physical, with fights that felt like they hurt. Moore's were more spectacular and polished, filled with clever tricks and over-the-top set pieces. Connery's humor was subtle, delivered with a dry sharpness that could cut an opponent down as effectively as a punch. Moore's humor was broader, leaning into one-liners that stuck in people's heads long after the credits rolled. Connery's Bond might walk away from an explosion without a word. Moore's would stroll away while adjusting his cufflinks and making a joke. And yet, despite all the differences, they were both undeniably Bond. They both embodied the fantasy of the ultimate spy, the man who could handle anything, go anywhere, and never lose his cool. They both gave audiences a reason to come back film after film. In a strange way, the contrast between them made the characters stronger. It proved that James Bond wasn't just one man. He was an idea that could be molded to fit the mood of the time. By the time Connery finally spoke openly about Moore's take on the role, at the age of 89, the debate had been raging for decades. He made it clear that their Bonds were different on purpose, one grounded in reality, the other playing with parody. But he also acknowledged that Moore's version worked for his audience. That's the thing about two Bonds for two eras. Neither erased the other. They were chapters in the same story, written with different pens, but bound together by the same name and the same number. And for fans, that's part of the magic. Knowing that James Bond can survive any era, any style, and still be, well, Bond. When people talk about Sean Connery and Roger Moore, the conversation almost always turns into a debate over which one was the better Bond. But if you look beyond the tuxedos, the stunts, and the box office numbers, there's a whole other side to their story. One that has nothing to do with competition, and everything to do with mutual respect, personal connection, and the way two men with very different approaches to the same role managed to form a genuine bond of their own. On screen, they were worlds apart. Connery's Bond was steel and shadow, the kind of man you believed could slip through a locked door and take down an enemy without blinking. Moore's Bond was charm and wit, a hero who could disarm a villain with a joke before even reaching for a weapon. You might think that difference would create tension between them, especially in a franchise as iconic as James Bond, but in reality, their relationship was surprisingly warm. Connery and Moore didn't see each other as rivals, fighting for the crown. They understood that they were playing the same character for completely different audiences and different moments in time. They first crossed paths during the years when Moore had already stepped into the role and Connery was long past his official tenure as Seven. At events, interviews, and charity functions, their interactions were always easy, full of smiles and little asides. Connery could poke fun at Moore's lighter, more playful Bond, and Moore would happily fire back with a joke about Connery's brooding intensity. It was the kind of banter that made it obvious there was no bitterness, just a shared understanding of the strange, unique experience of being Bond. Few people in the world could truly relate to the pressure, the scrutiny, and the lifelong association that came with that role, and that gave them common ground that outsiders couldn't touch. Over time, the public saw glimpses of how genuine their friendship was. At industry events, Moore would often talk about Connery not as a competitor, but as someone he admired, the man who set the standard for Seven and whose footsteps he was honored to follow. Connery, for his part, respected Moore's ability to keep the franchise alive in a changing Hollywood, even if he didn't personally approach the role the same way. There was no jealousy about who had more fans or which movies made more money. They knew those comparisons were inevitable, but they didn't let them get in the way. The human side of their relationship came out most clearly when they spoke about each other in later years. Moore was open about the fact that he and Connery didn't hang out constantly. They weren't best friends who spent every weekend together, but when they did cross paths, the warmth was immediate. It was like two old soldiers meeting again, sharing an unspoken bond forged through the same battles, even if those battles were fought on very different cinematic fronts. Connery's acknowledgement of Moore's passing in 2017 was simple but heartfelt. He called him a great man and a great friend, words that carried weight because Connery was never one for flowery speeches. Moore had a similar way of speaking about Connery, always with a smile, always making it clear that he saw him as more than just the other Bond. That mutual respect was rare in an industry where egos can run high and careers are often defined by competition. They also shared something else that's easy to overlook: a deep understanding of the toll the Bond role can take on a person. Both men had experienced the intensity of public attention, the typecasting, and the constant comparisons to whoever came before or after. They knew the role could be a blessing and a burden. In that way, their relationship was built on empathy. They could joke about martinis and gadgets in public, but they also understood the quieter challenges, the pressure to always live up to the image, the difficulty of moving on to other roles, the way fans sometimes expected the man to be the character. That empathy extended beyond the cameras. Away from the spotlight, they each lived full, private lives. But when they met, there was always that sense of recognition, the look in the eye that said, "I know exactly what you've been through." It's a connection that doesn't fade easily, no matter how different your paths are. In later interviews, Connery admitted that he could appreciate Moore's humor more as time went on. In his younger years, he'd been all about grit and realism, but with age came perspective. He saw that Moore had given Bond something he himself never could, a lighter touch that made the character appealing to a whole new wave of audiences. And Moore, in turn, acknowledged that without Connery's groundwork, he might never have had the opportunity to play Bond at all. Their relationship was never about proving who was the definitive Bond. It was about recognizing that they were two chapters in the same story, each essential, each valuable, each shaped by the era that wrote them. They didn't need to outshine each other because they knew the franchise was bigger than both of them. And in that understanding, they found something more enduring than box office numbers or fan rankings. In the end, the human side of Sean Connery and Roger Moore's relationship wasn't defined by tuxedos, Aston Martins, or shaken not stirred martinis. It was defined by respect, empathy, and a shared legacy. They knew what it meant to carry the weight of being James Bond, and they respected how each of them had done it in their own way. That's why, even decades after they first met, they could still smile when they saw each other. Because deep down, they both knew they were part of something that would outlast them, and they were proud to have carried it together. When people talk about Sean Connery and Roger Moore, the conversation usually starts with comparisons. Who played the better Bond? Who had the bigger box office hits? Whose style really captured Ian Fleming's original vision? For decades, fans have debated it like it's a competition, but the truth is, Connery and Moore never lived their lives like rivals. In fact, their legacy proves that you don't need rivalry to make history. Their careers and their portrayals of James Bond ran on parallel tracks, and yet, instead of clashing, They complemented one another in ways that kept the franchise alive for more than half a century. Sean Connery was the first to wear the tuxedo, set the standard, and defined what James Bond would mean on screen. His Bond was sharp-edged, dangerous but charming, the kind of man who could smile one second and take down an opponent the next. When Connery walked away from the role, it was more than just a casting change. It felt like the end of an era. Many wondered if anyone could fill his shoes, and the risk of the franchise collapsing without him was real. Then came Roger Moore, completely different in tone, style, and presence. His Bond wasn't as brooding or intimidating. Instead, he brought a lighter, more humorous approach. He could deliver a one-liner as effortlessly as Connery could deliver a knockout punch. To the surprise of many, this shift didn't weaken the franchise. It kept it alive by adapting to a changing world. Moore knew he couldn't out-Connery, so he didn't even try. He made Bond his own, and Connery respected that. The absence of rivalry between them was clear in how they spoke about each other. Connery would acknowledge Moore's ability to keep the role fresh, while Moore often credited Connery with paving the way for his own success. They understood that the Bond character was bigger than either of them, and that trying to undermine one another would have done nothing but hurt the legacy they were both helping to build. Publicly, their paths only crossed occasionally, at industry events, charity functions, or mutual appearances related to Bond anniversaries. But when they did meet, the interaction was never awkward. There were smiles, handshakes, and jokes. They didn't trade barbs out of bitterness. They traded them out of mutual affection. The jokes about each other's styles, about Moore's raised eyebrow or Connery's intense delivery, were always in good fun. The respect was genuine. Privately, they shared an understanding few could. Being James Bond wasn't just a job, it was a lifetime identity. It shaped how people saw them, how the press treated them, and even how studios approached them for other roles. Both men knew the pressure of carrying such a massive cultural icon on their shoulders, and the scrutiny that came with every performance. That understanding created an unspoken bond between them, one that didn't need constant interaction to remain strong. Their careers outside of Bond also showed how secure they were in their own legacies. Connery went on to have a rich post-Bond career, winning an Oscar for The Untouchables, playing in films like Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, and proving he was far more than just Seven. Moore devoted much of his later life to humanitarian work as a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador, traveling the world to help children in need. Neither felt the need to constantly outshine the other's accomplishments because they weren't in the same race to begin with. This mutual respect extended even to how they handled fan comparisons. Interviews often brought up the question, who was the better Bond? And both would laugh it off. Moore would say things like, "I was just keeping the seat warm for Sean," and Connery would praise Moore's ability to bring a different kind of charm to the role. They didn't fuel the debate, they diffused it. When Moore passed away in 2017, Connery's tribute was simple and heartfelt. He called Moore a great man and a great friend, a short statement that carried more meaning than a long eulogy ever could. Coming from a man known for being reserved with public emotion, those words spoke volumes. And when Connery died in 2020, the tributes to both of them made it clear. The world didn't remember them as rivals, it remembered them as two legends who built something together, even if they did it apart. Their legacy without rivalry is a rare thing in Hollywood. This is an industry that thrives on competition, where actors are often pitted against each other for headlines, roles, and public favor. Yet here were two men tied to the same role, one of the most famous roles in cinema history, who managed to keep their relationship grounded in respect instead of jealousy. That choice didn't just make their personal lives easier, it also made the Bond franchise stronger. Fans didn't have to pick sides. They could enjoy both interpretations without feeling like one diminished the other. Looking back, the lack of rivalry between Connery and Moore feels almost old-fashioned, a reminder of a time when dignity and mutual respect could take priority over public sparring. It showed that two actors could share the same cinematic mantle and still stand side by side without trying to knock each other down. And in doing so, they left behind a dual legacy that remains unmatched in the world of film. The truth is, Connery and Moore were never really competing. They were playing the same role in different eras, under different circumstances, for different audiences. And instead of trying to erase each other's contributions, they let those differences stand. It's why today, decades after both men first stepped into Bond's shoes, the debate over who was better continues, not because one won and the other lost, but but because both left something so distinct and so lasting that neither can be forgotten. Their story is proof that sometimes the most powerful legacy you can leave isn't built by defeating someone else. It's built by walking your own path, doing your work with excellence, and respecting those who've walked it before you. That's exactly what Sean Connery and Roger Moore did. And that's why their names will forever be linked, not as rivals, but as equals in the history of James Bond.